Living in a peaceful suburban neighborhood seemed like the dream. It was quiet, full of families, and far enough from the bustle of the city that you could enjoy some real peace of mind. At least, that's what I thought when I moved into my house a few years ago. Little did I know that lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic community was a powerful force of nosy. Entitled homeowners who could turn anyone's dream into a nightmare, the HOA, or Homeowners Association. Now, to be clear, I was not a member of the HOA. My house was outside their jurisdiction, and when I bought the place, I made sure of it. The HOA could have their rules and regulations, but they didn't apply to me, or so I thought. What I didn't realize was that in their eyes, if you lived anywhere within a mile of their controlled zone, you were fair game, especially if you happened to live near the most notorious neighborhood busybody, a woman I came to know as Karen. It all started innocently enough. I had planned a small gathering at my house. Nothing wild, just a few friends, some food, and an evening in the backyard. The highlight of my backyard, at least to me, was the jacuzzi. I had it installed not long after moving in, and it quickly became my favorite spot to unwind after a long day. The bubbling water, the soft glow of the patio lights, and the quiet hum of the night made it the perfect escape from reality. That particular evening, everything was going smoothly. The grill was fired up, the music was playing softly in the background, and my friends and I were relaxing in the jacuzzi, enjoying a much-needed break from the stresses of everyday life. There were maybe 8 of us in total. Nothing too rowdy or out of control. Just good company, good conversation, and good vibes all around. But then, I saw her, Karen. She was standing at the edge of my property, just outside the fence, peering in with that unmistakable expression of self-righteous indignation that I would come to know all too well. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Neighborhoods have nosy neighbors. It's practically a given. So, I waved at her, trying to be polite, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Karen didn't wave back. Instead, she just stood there for a few more moments, glaring at us like we were doing something criminal by simply enjoying ourselves in my own backyard. Eventually, she turned and marched back to her house, which was a few doors down from mine, and I didn't think much more of it. That was my first mistake. The evening continued without incident. For the most part, we ate, we drank, and we spent hours in the jacuzzi, soaking in the warmth and relaxation. It wasn't until later, after everyone had left and I was getting ready to wind down for the night, that the trouble really began. I was still in my backyard, cleaning up some of the leftover dishes, when I noticed the sound of footsteps approaching. I glanced over the fence and saw 2 men, both wearing matching polo shirts with some sort of emblem on the front. They were clearly part of the HOA, and they had that same stern, disapproving look that Karen had worn earlier in the evening. "Can we help you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. I wasn't a member of the HOA, and as far as I knew, they had no authority over me. So what were they doing here? "We've had some complaints about a disturbance," one of the men said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It seems you were having a party that was loud enough to disrupt the neighborhood." I couldn't help but laugh. A disturbance? Loud enough to disrupt the neighborhood? I looked around. The music had been quiet. My guests were gone, and the only sound was the faint bubbling of the jacuzzi. There was no way this gathering had been anything close to a disturbance. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," I said. "I wasn't throwing a wild party. Just a few friends over for dinner and a soak in the jacuzzi. And besides, I'm not part of the HOA, so I'm not sure why you're even here." The 2 men exchanged glances, clearly not used to being told that their authority didn't extend as far as they thought. "That may be true," the second man said, "but we still receive complaints, and we take complaints from our residents very seriously. We're just here to make sure everything is in order." I was starting to get annoyed. They had no right to be here, no right to come onto my property and tell me how to live my life. I wasn't causing any problems, and I certainly wasn't part of their HOA. But before I could argue further, I saw Karen again, standing just behind the 2 men. Her arms were crossed, and she had that smug, triumphant look on her face that told me everything I needed to know. She had called them. This wasn't about a noise complaint. This was about Karen trying to exert her control over the neighborhood, even over people who weren't part of her precious HOA. She didn't like that I had a jacuzzi, that I had friends over, that I was enjoying myself. And so, she had called in the HOA enforcers to ruin my evening. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to back down. This was my home, my property, and I wasn't going to let some nosy neighbor or the HOA tell me what I could and couldn't do in my own backyard. "Look," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I appreciate that you're just doing your job, but like I said, I'm not part of the HOA. So, unless I'm breaking some kind of law, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave." The two men seemed taken aback by my response. They clearly weren't used to people standing up to them, especially not when Karen was involved. But after a moment of awkward silence, they turned and left, with Karen shooting me one last dirty look before she followed them back to her house. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I had stood my ground and won. But I was wrong. Things were about to get much worse. The next day, I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. It was one of my friends who had been at the party the night before. She sounded frantic, and it took me a moment to understand what she was saying. "Did you see the neighborhood Facebook page?" she asked. "Karen posted about you." I groaned. Of course, she had. I quickly pulled up the page on my phone, and sure enough, there it was, a lengthy post from Karen, detailing the horrible disturbance I had caused the night before. She made it sound like I had thrown a rager that had kept the entire neighborhood up all night. And she even accused me of violating some imaginary HOA rule about noise levels. The comments below her post were filled with people agreeing with her, demanding that something be done to stop me from disrupting the peace. It was ridiculous. There had been no disturbance, no wild party, and no violation of any HOA rules. Because, again, I wasn't part of the HOA. I was livid. Karen had crossed the line, and now she was dragging my name through the mud on a public forum. But I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I replied to her post, calmly explaining that I wasn't part of the HOA and that there had been no disturbance. I pointed out that I had been within my rights to have friends over and that the only disruption had been Karen's constant interference. I thought that would be the end of it, that the truth would prevail and people would see that Karen was just being unreasonable. But Karen wasn't done. A few days later, I came home from work to find a notice taped to my front door. It was from the HOA, demanding that I cease all disruptive activities and threatening to take legal action if I didn't comply. It was absurd. Again, I wasn't part of the HOA, and they had no authority over me. But that didn't stop them from trying to intimidate me into submission. I decided to ignore the notice. I wasn't going to let them bully me into following rules that didn't apply to me. But Karen wasn't done with her campaign against me. About a week later, I decided to invite a few friends over again, this time for a more low-key gathering. No music, no party, just a few people relaxing in the backyard. I thought I could avoid any more issues with Karen by keeping things quiet. I was wrong. It was late in the evening, and we were sitting in the jacuzzi, enjoying the warm water and the cool night air. Suddenly, we heard a commotion coming from the front of the house. At first, I thought it was just someone walking by, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of police sirens. I got out of the jacuzzi, threw on a robe, and walked to the front of the house. To my shock, there were two police officers standing at my door, and behind them, I saw Karen standing on the sidewalk, her arms crossed, looking smug as ever. The officers explained that they had received a call about a disturbance at my house and that they had been told there was a party that had gotten out of hand. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. There was no party, just a few friends quietly relaxing in the backyard. But Karen had called 911, exaggerating the situation to get the police involved. I explained the situation to the officers, who, to their credit, seemed to realize pretty quickly that Karen had wasted their time. After a brief conversation, they left, clearly frustrated that they had been called out for something so trivial. As for Karen, she stood there, watching me with a smug grin on her face, clearly thinking she had won. But I wasn't about to let her get the last laugh. I called a lawyer the next day and started looking into my legal options. It turns out, I had plenty. Karen had overstepped her bounds. The HOA had no authority over me, and I wasn't going to let them continue harassing me. A few weeks later, after some back and forth with my lawyer, Karen received a cease and desist letter, informing her that any further harassment would result in legal action. As for the HOA, they were forced to back off as well. They couldn't enforce rules on someone who wasn't part of their association. And once I made that clear, they had no choice but to leave me alone. In the end, I won. Karen never bothered me again, and the HOA learned that they couldn't push me around. It was a long, frustrating ordeal, but I came out on top. So, if you're ever dealing with an entitled Karen or an overreaching HOA, just remember, stand your ground, know your rights, and don't let them bully you into submission. It might take some time, but in the end, you can come out on top.